2, 1. And I believe we are live once again. Welcome, everyone, to the Bench Doctor. We've been doing this approximately weekly, even though we occasionally take a week off. And tonight, Scott's going to tell us all about what's on his bench. Literally, what the Bench Doctor uses to doctor things. But first, he's going to actually show us that he was able to reassemble a gun that he failed to reassemble on camera a couple of weeks ago. As always, if you've been here before, you want to if you have a question, drop it in the comments on the chat inside the Zoom, and we'll get to it. And one of the moderators tonight, we've got Lonnie, we've got me, we've got Eric. We have inexplicably not got Mike Ross, so I'm going to have to give him a little nudge. So one of the moderators will pick the question up. We'll interrupt at an appropriate time, ask the question, get it answered, etc. So ask questions throughout if you need to. And I think we're ready to rock. Are you ready, Scott?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you. It's all yours, sir.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Ed wanted me to start off by showing you the MAB that I took apart, and it was a new to me gun that I got, and I tore it all down and cleaned it, and was having a heck of a time getting it reassembled. It's patterned after the Colt 1903, where you rotate the barrel and it locks into the frame at a specific point, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, if you watch the last video that we did, I had a heck of a time getting it back together, but it is back together and it is working. I did take it out and shoot it. I was able to ping some steel at 20 yards with it, believe it or not, with 32 ACP, but it is now back together and working. So anyway, we go ahead and get this off the bench, lock it open, move it out of my way. So I've had questions off and on through Discord and private messages and stuff, and people asking, if I'm going to work on guns, what should I get? And I figured I'd take some time and just kind of go through some of the basic hand tools and things like that, if you're going to work on guns, are really handy to have. Some of them are model specific to certain guns. But there's so many AR-15s out there now, and building AR-15s is kind of a little cottage industry. I thought I'd show you some of the stuff that you don't necessarily need to do it, but are very handy to have. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started with basic cleaning stuff. If nothing else, get yourself some nylon brushes, nylon and brass brushes. I use these things a lot for cleaning, and breaking up crud. So these, and you can pick these up at Harbor Freight. They're dirt cheap, or you can order them from Amazon. I think they come in like a 5-pack. But these are super, super handy to have. And then cleaning rods, patches, the bore snakes. These for specific calibers. These are nice. You just drop them down the bore of a gun and pull them through, and try to clean them from the chamber side. But these are just super simple. You just drop them down like that, pull them through, and they have a little brass right here. It's probably not showing up, but there's a little bit of brass right there that kind of breaks crud loose, and then you just pull it through. And I like to put a little bit of solvent on the leading edge of it and then pull this through several times. If you don't want to take the time to use patches and a rod or something like that, these work great. And they roll right up, and you can throw them in a range bag or a little toolbox or something. So these bore snakes are really nice. I use them more on rifles than I do handguns. And I carry one in my range bag if I'm at a match or something and I want to, clean something really quick. That's how I do it. If I'm going to give it a deep cleaning, I'll take the gun apart and use patches. So anyway, yeah, good cleaning stuff is a must-have. And along with good cleaning stuff, I really recommend you get a set of dental picks. They don't have to be expensive ones. even old used ones are great. You can pick them up at swap meets and stuff, gun shows, and they're really handy to get into really tight spaces. And also I use them to kind of tuck patches down into areas that I can't get to by hand. And you'll see some of these are this one's pretty worn, pretty beat up and bent, but I use these a lot. So I would strongly suggest you get some dental picks. You can also modify them if you want, and take a file or something and just round off the edge so that it won't dig or gouge into something. That's the danger with using steel. Is it is a hard metal, and you can scratch things if you're not careful. But I find dental picks to be really, really useful to have. And like I said, they're $10, and then sometimes a little mirror is really nice to be able to get in and see into an area that you can't see otherwise.
Scott,
A little.
quick question. I years ago I acquired a set of plastic or polymer dental picks.
Yeah,
so
something like that.
Yeah, exactly like that. So all right, so fine. Never mind.
Yeah, if I use these some, but this particular set that I have are a little soft, so that you can see how flexible it is, which is useful in some cases and not in others. So I do use them, but I
do you have advice on dragging hard steel against?
Yeah, I don't use I don't use steel on steel unless I have to. But the picks, I tend to use them more with another cleaning media like a patch. So what I'll do is let me grab a patch and I'll show you what I would do is take something like this pick, grab a patch.
Hey Scott, while you're pulling that up, there's a question about using WD-40 to clean guns.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it. It's WD-40 is a water displacement. If it's all you got, I suppose but it's not really a solvent. It's more or less diesel fuel and some other stuff. But it's meant to displace water. So if you have you want to get water out of the threads on something, that's what it was designed to do. It's not really a lubricant, and it's not really a solvent. But in a pinch, I suppose it's better than nothing. But it leaves an oily residue, and it can kind of accumulate crud. So I don't use it myself, and I wouldn't recommend it. But it's your gun, and if it works for you, then by all means. But what I'll do is I'll take a pick like this, and I'll wrap it around my pick, and then I can get down in and I can shove that down into areas that I can't get to with a regular cleaning brush or patch. So they're really good for that. And then on certain areas of bolts where the extractor is, there's no real way to clean the crud that accumulates under there. So I'll get under there and just kind of scrape it out. But yeah, you do have to be aware. And like I said, you can dull these down if it worries you. Just take a file or something or some sandpaper and dull it down so it's not quite as pointy, and you'll reduce your risk of scratching stuff. But it's really good for getting into those really tight spaces too. 22s accumulate a whole lot of carbon, and on the bolts on the Mark series pistols, I use these a lot to get down in there. And also where the extractor fits into the top of the upper, I dig in there with these. And I'm not worried about scraping that up. You can't see it anyway. But yeah, and then that brings me to my, another subject, which is hammers. These are nice to have, hammers for removing roll pins or persuading things, but I don't use steel hammers on my guns. You see, this is brass, and then this is plastic. This is a little heavier one for a little more persuasion. And it does have I can put that head on it and swap it out for the brass one, but I don't ever use this on guns because it will damage the finish and it will scratch things. So I just stick to brass hammers, and they're cheap. This is specifically made by Lyman for working on guns. But yeah, I don't sit there, because if you miss tapping in a roll pin or removing a pin of some kind and hit the finish with a brass hammer, it's not going to damage it. and damage the gun. I don't care about damaging the hammer. Every once in a while, I'll take these and I'll get some really fine files and I'll polish these until they're super smooth. And this one's getting about to the point where it needs to be done. So there are no ridges in it. But the plastic, I really don't care. I just beat on that. So yeah, metal tools or steel tools on guns used cautiously. This is a tool for working on 1911s and AR-15s. This one's for the AR-15, and it's got a scraper here. This meets the radius on the bolt, and it's for scraping the carbon off. So that is another place where you pretty much don't have a choice, because brass isn't going to remove that accumulated crud that can form on an AR bolt. And this is a very hard steel, so you got to be careful doing it. But I don't really, in most cases, feel like I have much of a choice. But these are nice to have in your range bag. They make them for, I think it's called the operator survival tool. Not that I'm an operator, but it's handy because this also fits the buffer tube. So if your buffer tube isn't staked and it comes loose, you can just put that over and tighten the buffer tube. There's a little prying edge right here, you know, a little hex wrench. So these are nice to have. I have one for the 1911. Also, I have this, which I know Ed's familiar with. This is for taking the barrel bushing off of a 1911. And so that goes down on the barrel, and then you can twist and rotate the barrel bushing. I keep this in my range bag if my 1911 is going to the range with me, or if I'm going to be working on the gun, I'll get this out. It just makes it a lot easier. And you can also notice that this is got the same profile as a 1911 mag. So if I wanted to put my 1911 in a vise and work on it from the top down, this would work. And I'd rather put this in a vise than a magazine. So these are nice to have. These bushing wrench, I think, is what they're called. So there are, like I said, platform-specific tools, but I find them to be pretty useful for a lot of other things. Like another set I have here, these are for the Colt Single Action Army, and these screwdriver heads are matched to every screw on the gun. So any screw you're going to take off of a Single Action Army, I have the corresponding screw head for it. It's the exact right thickness and width, so that you don't risk scratching the gun or boogering up the screws. And you can get these for a lot of different guns. I got these at Brownells, and then I use this tool for other guns as well. This is for popping out the rod. So you want to stick that under there, and you can kind of pry that rod out without gouging the heck out of it or scratching it. So this is kind of a handy little tool. It's made specifically for the Single Action Army, but it works on the Blackhawks and the Ruger 22 pistols. So, one thing I always harp on people about is buying good screwdrivers. I like to use these little cheapy, this I think is a Vermont American, I don't know where, I think I got it at Ace Hardware. These are really nice to have laying around for everything but screws. If you're going to use screwdrivers on guns, and you usually don't have a choice, get the hollow ground screwdriver tips and just spend the money, cry once. You can see the profile of these is different. This is kind of a wedge shaped, and this is hollow ground, so that this tip isn't wedge shaped. It's the correct width all the way through where it would fit into the screw head. So buy a set. I have over here, let me grab this. I have a couple of different sets of these. This is the one I use most often because it's always on my bench. It's made by Weaver, and it comes with an assortment of screw heads, and it, with also Allen keys and Phillips. And then this is, for removing those nuts that hold, like on a Mauser, and a lot of older barrel or bolt action guns had nuts that like a little ring with two dots in it two holes in it, and that's what that's meant for. But this is made specifically for working on guns, and it's not expensive. And you can always replace the tips. You know, you can, if you break one or you damage one, just order another tip. And you can get these things at pretty much any reputable gunsmith. Midway, Brownells carries them. But get hollow ground screwdrivers. They're worth their weight in gold, and especially if you're working on older guns, guns that have a lot of value, you don't want to wreck the screws because they're oftentimes very difficult to get if you do ruin one. This is another set that I got.
Quick question before we move on that. So,
yeah.
Any love for CLP?
I love it. Yeah, I have a can of it here on my bench somewhere. I use a lot of CLP. Yeah, it's cleaning, lubricant, and protection, I think is what CLP stands for. Military uses tons of it. And I go shooting with a couple of vets, and they're always spraying the bolt down on their AR-15s with CLP. I like it a lot. I carry it in my range bag. I have a little jar about this big, you know, probably about that size. And I carry that with a little cleaning kit. So when I'm shooting like practical pistol or IDPA, if I have a problem, I can quickly clean and lubricate the gun with just one little bottle of chemical. I don't need to carry a bunch of other stuff. So no, I like CLP a lot. I like this stuff too, Ballistol. This stuff works good, and it's non-toxic. So if you're, you know, when I'm out in the garage and the dog's around, I don't like spraying stuff with the dog or the kid around. So I'll use Ballistol because it is, you know, non-toxic. But this stuff works good too. It's the same as CLP. It just smells different. So, but this is a set. I think it was CDNN. I ordered something from them, and they had a little promotion going where they threw in this screwdriver set. I've seen it marketed by Winchester and a few other manufacturers, but it's the handiest thing. I carry it in a oversized range bag, and it's got just about every tip. It's got these little tiny Allen head or you know, hex head tips that are really handy. And they're not, I see them all these kits all the time for 10 or 15 bucks. And I've used this thing countless times. It saved me or somebody else a whole lot of grief. But you can see it's got all of the hollow ground tips in it. Doesn't have every single size, but you're going to get pretty close. So I think CDNN carries them, but sometimes you'll see it with a white Winchester logo across the top of it. So if you see that one of these, grab it. They're super useful. There's another company that makes really top of the line screwdrivers that I recommend is Grace. You know, you'll see this brand. These have been around for 1 million years, and these are really nice screwdrivers as well. They're kind of old school with the wooden handles on them, and they make sets of these for pretty much any gun you can imagine as well. And then they make it assorted sets. These are fairly expensive, but they're very nice set of screwdrivers. So if you can, or you see it, you know, sometimes you'll see them for sale at yard sales and stuff. People are just selling off tools. If you see a set of gray screwdrivers, grab them. This is another set of another tool. It's a ratchet tool that I got off of Amazon, and I use it a lot as well. It's really convenient. It's got a little, I like the case because it's metal and it's sturdy, and it doesn't have a whole lot of screwdriver tips, but it's got a whole lot of star bit tips. And I don't use Phillips screwdrivers much on guns, but these star tips are really useful. A lot of gun manufacturers are going to those now. And like I said, it's a ratcheting one, so it has, you know, you can use the extension, and you know, so this can be pretty handy sometimes too. And I got it on Amazon. I don't remember how much it was, but it wasn't expensive at all. And let me see if I can find the brand on it, just in the event somebody wanted to buy one.
Scott, those those Torx bits are also the security type.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've never seen the security holes or, you know, the pins on guns, but yeah. Oh, it says Sunex, SUNEX tools, if you're interested in the actual brand. But I find this to be super useful, and it's nice and compact for a range bag. So I like that one a lot. I use it constantly. And then if you're really going to spend time working on guns, and you want to do things right, you're going to need an inch-pound torque wrench for tightening screws, especially setting up optics, scope rings, and things like that. The manufacturers will have specific torque settings, and this is the best gun torque wrench I've found so far. It's called the Fat Wrench, and it works with all these bits from the other sets that I have. It's super easy to set. You just pull down and you set this gauge to whatever inch pounds you want, and tighten, and tighten, and it is a torque wrench, so it will release at the proper torque setting. These I think are less than $50, but if you're going to be doing a lot of work with guns and gun fasteners, you're going to want one of these. And do pay attention to those torque settings, because you don't want to make the mistake of inch pounds versus foot pounds. You will break things and it will go horribly wrong. But this is called the Fat Wrench. It's made by Wheeler. So I only suggest you buy one of these. It's a one-time investment, especially if you're working on optics, setting up scope rings, and scope mounts. They're very specific about the torque settings, because if you are too loose, you can warp things, and you can out of whack. So I highly recommend the Fat Wrench. And you see them on sale, like on Black Friday. I see them on sale every year. I just replaced the one I had, and picked up that one. Let's see these.
Yeah, Karen just posted that Midway's having a sale on the analog one for $35.
Oh yeah, it's worth it. It's well worth it. Thank you, Karen. And it takes all of the regular screw bits, so you don't have to worry about buying specific Wheeler tips. It'll take any tip you have, Torx bits, whatever you've got. And if you want to do it right, buy an inch-pound torque wrench. I have several of these. I carry these in my, these are the freebies. I'm not sure where I got this one. It's both Phillips and standard, but these are great for adjusting optics, like red dots. I don't if you've had any experience with them, you know how tiny those little adjustment screws are. And these are great at getting in there, and they're dirt cheap. A lot of times, I think Ace Hardware and places like that tend to have them just on the counter for a couple of bucks. And I keep one of these in every range bag, and I have one in my truck. Just a little cheapy screwdriver, but it's so tiny that it's one of the few things that you can actually adjust those optics screws with. And something else along the lines of cleaning, but for other purposes, these are shish kebab sticks. I use these all the time with guns. Sometimes if I want, I use them for the same reason I use the dental picks. I'll wrap a patch around that and poke it down into areas that I can't get to with another tool. And they break, and I just sharpen them with a pocket knife. This is an untouched one here. This one's been, used and broken many times, but I'd much rather sacrifice a shish kebab stick than break a part on a gun. They're also good for sometimes, using as a punch to kind of persuade things without damaging stuff, because it is a sacrificial material. So, some of these are just handy to have around. Along that same line, punches are kind of a whole nother topic, but I keep brass punches on my bench. I have a small one here, it's two sizes, and then I have this big fat one. And these are nice because, especially if it's an older gun, you don't want to mar up the finish on the outward facing side of a punch brass punches are really good for tapping those pins in and out without damaging something. A regular steel punch can damage the bluing or scratch parkerizing and things like that. So, you know, brass punches are essential to have, you know, with a good brass hammer.
So Scott, there's a question about, is there actually a published torque value for small screws and nuts on firearms?
Yeah, they're usually, well, yeah, I'm sure there are. In the fat wrench, it comes with a guide. It's not really comprehensive, but it says here 18 to 20 inch-pounds for number 6 screws, typically used to mount bases. 28 to 30, typically used for rings. 40 to 45, typically used for windage screws and standard style bases. 65 plus inch-pounds for fasteners with the thread diameter larger than number 10. There's quite a bit of information just on this card. That's why I keep it in the box. But a lot of gun manuals will have the inch-pound recommendations published in the manuals. So, but I'm sure there's probably now with the internet some good reference material out there to get those values. Because some of those little tiny screws will snap off really easily, and you'd be surprised how light the torque value is on some of those things. You know, in the old days, guys would just crank them down tight, and now with Loctite and a torque wrench, you know, you don't need to put all of that power on them. And on the subject of Loctite, please don't use red Loctite on guns unless you absolutely have no choice. Use blue. A couple of reasons. One, red is just miserable to remove, and you don't want to. What removes it is heat, and so putting heat to certain parts of guns is a really bad idea. You can ruin the metal doing that, and in other areas, the gun itself gets really hot, which then heats up the red Loctite, rendering it kind of useless anyway. So use blue Loctite if you're going to use Loctite on your guns, and I do use it on screws that I for optics. I run a Vortex Viper on my SIG 320, and I always blue Loctite the mounts on that, as well as scope rings and bases. I use blue Loctite on those as well, but just save yourself a lot of headache and don't use red. But on punches, I have 2 sets. I have a steel set and I have a set of roll pin punches. Both are very handy to have. The roll pin punches, if you're not familiar with them, have this little domed end on them, and they're good for putting in roll pins. But this fits down in kind of the head of the roll pin, and then this kind of guides the outside as you pound it in, and it allows it pushes the pin in without deforming or mushrooming out the head of the roll pin. And then this makes it easy to kind of guide the pin down in. If you've ever put in a the roll pin on a gas block on an AR-15, the roll pin punch makes it relatively easy instead of just using a regular flat punch. But I have a full set of roll pin punches, and then I have a full set. It looks like I have a couple somewhere on the bench that I haven't found yet, but these are just regular punches. They're just flat. I use the tiny ones more than anything. You can see these are kind of beat up, but these are kind of a must-have nowadays, is a set of punches of some kind. They're used all the time, especially if you work on AR-15s. A set of hand files. This is one set that I have. I have another set with wood handles on them. For older guns, fitting parts is just a reality. Next week, we're going to have a guest host on this channel that is going to go into, spend some time going into depth on the 1911s. And with 1911s, just about every replacement part that you have to fix on one of those, you have to fit. And a good set of files are critical. You're just not going to get parts to fit unless you have the ability to file them. And these aren't expensive. You can pick these up, oh gosh, you know, a multitude of places, but there's different styles. You know, this is a radiused, you probably can't see it, but it's slightly radiused. And these are flat, and they're different grits. So, you know, an assortment of these are really nice to have. And also for getting into, you know, tight spaces where you can't normally get a large file. So I would suggest you get a set of hand files. And don't worry about damaging them. They're cheap. You know, if you break one, just go buy another set. On the subject of optics and scopes, a set of these are really nice to have. They're levels. So this, you know, for leveling the gun, you want to get the gun level in the vise, and then you want to get the scope itself or the rings level. So that's what these are. They're magnetic, and you know, you're able to get the gun exactly where you want it as you set the scope. And these aren't expensive either, but they're almost a must-have to me for putting on scopes and getting them right the first time. So, you know, this, like I said, they're all magnetic. So a set of those is really useful and handy to have. A micrometer and a, let's see here. So measuring tools, you know, these, I use this all the time. If you want to, you know, you can measure the outside length of a screw. You can measure the inside diameter of something. You can measure depth with this. So a set of calipers and a micrometer, but you know, a digital caliper, you can get an old school dial caliper too, works just fine. But these are super handy and incredibly useful to have. The tolerances on guns are very, very fine. And I find these to be critical. And you know, buy a decent one. I can't think of the brand name, but you know, of the preferred one. This one isn't terribly expensive, but it's a little nicer. And like I said, I use these all the time. They're both metric and standard. And especially if you're going to get into reloading. If you're going to reload at all, you're going to need these. There's just no way around it. So a set of calipers. And then I have feeler gauges. You know, these are nice to have too for measuring the gaps on things. I don't know if you know anybody that's worked on cars in the old breaker point ignitions or gapping spark plugs is probably familiar with these, but they're just they're meant for measuring gaps. You know, you would slide these in, and you know, you find the one that fits, and the one, you know, this is 10 thousandths. This is 12 thousandths. You know, so if you wanted to know the proper gap, or you know, fitting something together, they'd say it needs a 10,000th clearance on a part. You know, this is what you would use as a feeler gauge to get in there and make sure you got it right on both sides. So a cheapy little feeler gauge. These can be picked up at an auto parts store for, they're not expensive at all, but I find them to be indispensable when you need one. And along the lines of AR specific tools, this is a tool for removing handguards. And boy, if you've ever tried to remove some of those delta rings on a AR-15, this hooks down in the mag well, and then you squeeze it and pull down, and it will allow you to remove handguards on the AR-15s that use a delta ring. And these aren't expensive. This is a cheapie, but boy, they're sure nice to have. And then if you're going to do much work on ARs at all, an armorer's wrench is really, really useful. It has just about every wrench that you would use working on one. This is for the barrel nut, you know, for the delta ring style barrel nuts, you know, and it also has the cutout for attaching a torque wrench. So you know, you put your torque wrench in there, and then you can torque the barrel down. And so that's what these are for. 3/8.5 inch torque wrenches. You can tell that these are old school. It's got a 1911 bushing tool on it. These are made for removing the muzzle devices, and this end is for the buffer tube, to tighten the castle nut on a buffer tube. And this is kind of a, screwdriver pry bar type thing. These are $20, and if you're going to do a lot of work on AR-15s, finding one of these and having it on hand, you don't necessarily need to carry it in a range bag unless you want to use it as a melee weapon, but they're handy to have if you're going to build AR-15s. And I like the old retro AR-15, so I use the Delta ring style barrel nuts. But along that same line, if you're going to be doing modern AR-15s, the barrel nuts use conventional wrenches. And I found that most of them that I've worked on are 1 3/16. So I use this crow's foot wrench for tightening them down, and then you can put your torque wrench on there. And so, these are super handy. And this is also the same size as some of the dies for reloading, which also makes it, useful. This is a cheapie, got it on Amazon. And for as much as I use it and as much torque as I put on it, usually somewhere north of 35 pounds. So I'm not likely to damage it. I don't really need a super expensive Mac or, expensive crow's foot wrench. So that's what I use. So these are handy to have if you're working on the more modern ARs. Let's see, what else do we have on here? Forceps. Now, I know what everybody else uses forceps for. I suppose you could do that too. But I use these for holding little roll pins. So if I want to drive a roll pin in,
pull that up into the center of the camera. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'll grab a pin like that, so I don't have to try to hold this with my fingers and then hit it with a hammer. You can kind of hold it steady like that, and then tap it, like so. So a set of cheap forceps are super handy. Good to have around. And then this is just a pair of regular shears for cutting patches. I'm too cheap to buy 22 specific cleaning patches, so I just buy one size and cut them down. But just a cheapy pair of scissors is always good to have. Needle nose pliers, putting on springs or removing springs. Good fine tipped needle nose will save you a ton of headaches. So these are cheapies. You can pick up a whole set of like 3 of these at Ace Hardware. You don't need to spend a lot of money, but nice long thin needle nose pliers are very, very handy to have around. A brass rod. This is a section of an old cleaning rod. The threads got damaged at some point, so it's no longer any use as a cleaning rod, but it is really good for clearing barrel obstructions. If somebody's got a squib, a round that didn't exit the barrel, don't use steel. Use a wood dowel, or I prefer the brass. And you can pound this down the barrel and not worry about scratching the rifling or damaging anything. And it's also good for just sometimes using it as a long punch, but just a piece of brass, a brass dowel is handy to have in a lot of situations. We were talking about chemicals earlier. Somebody asked about CLP, and I use CLP. Like I said, I use the Ballistol quite a bit. Another really nice thing to have if you're going to work on old milsurp guns or older guns in general is some sort of a penetrating oil. This is PB Blaster. This stuff works really, really well. There's a product called Croil, spelled with a K. It's expensive, but it works really well. You can soak stuff in Croil overnight, and I found it works really well on carbon. If you have say a muzzle device that's on the end of a barrel and you just can't get it off, soaking it in Croil overnight and then going at it again the next day. Croil does a great job of loosening things up. This I use a ton for cleaning guns with the warning it stinks. It's probably not good for you. I use the non-chlorinated brake clean. Open your garage door. Do this outside. Don't do this in an enclosed space. But this stuff is really good at cleaning, you know, cosmoline and some of the old heavy greases, and it's really good for getting stuff clean. But be careful with it on plastics. I think I would remove any plastic grips or plastic parts, O-rings, things like that. I really can't say how it's going to react to plastics, but it works great on metal parts. And then what I'll do is I'll take one of these cheap little baking, you know, disposable baking things made out of aluminum. I'll put my parts in there, and then I'll spray it down with the brake clean and let it kind of soak. This stuff evaporates pretty quickly. But then I have something to contain it, and I can scrub it down. You know, as far as disposing of it, it evaporates, which is kind of nice because then you don't have to pour it into a jug and get rid of it. We have a waste disposal here that I just dump that stuff into and take it to the waste disposal and let them deal with it. But these are nice to have. I picked these up at Walmart. They're like 3 for $1. And they're really handy for working on guns. You know, you take things off and put it in the little tray, and it's got the high walls, so stuff isn't going to fall out of it. And it's really good for cleaning. And if you're going to be brushing, you know, parts, it contains the mess. So, you know, I would pick up, and they last quite a while. I've been on the same one for a good number of months now. I also have let me grab this over here. This is a magnetic tray as it's picking up the ballistol. And this is really handy for sometimes working on guns. It will contain, it'll hold the little springs and detents and things like that, so you don't lose them. These are really nice to have, but I don't use it a lot because it is magnetic, and I don't always want to magnetize the parts. But I keep it on. Whoa! Oh, there goes the lighting. I keep it on my bench and use it quite a bit. So a little magnetic parts tray is nice to have. Let me grab a light here and get some more light on this. Okay. And then as far as, you know, other things, other chemicals, I use this. It works pretty well for me. It's Mc7 Bore Cleaner. I use this on really foul barrels with a lot of copper, you know, fouling in them. What I'll do is run a wet patch. I'll get a patch really wet with this stuff. I'll run it down and I'll let it soak, you know, 15 or 20 minutes. And then I'll take a brass brush and scrub it. And then you just keep doing that over and over, and it will remove copper fouling. As far as lubricants, I love the Lucas Oil products. I use this a lot, this extreme duty gun oil. I like the little tiny fine tip on it. It allows you to get a drop of oil into tight spaces without making a big mess. And then I use the Lucas Oil gun grease on everything except my M1 Garand. I just use white lithium grease because I use so much of it on that gun that this stuff is expensive. So I don't want to use, you know, $12 worth of gun grease when that white lithium stuff works good. And I just got a bottle of this, and I so far really like it. It's the 6 Hour Spec 1. It's a really fine gun oil as well. But, you know, you don't need to spend a ton of money on gun oils. You can use Mobil 1 synthetic motor oil. People have been using motor oil on guns for years and years. There's nothing wrong with it. It works great. You know, I wouldn't tell you not to use it. Grease, you know, any grease is better than no grease. So, you know, if you don't want to spend a lot of money on gun specific lubricants, there's no real need to. I just prefer to use them myself because I've had good experiences with them. They haven't failed me. Another thing I just noticed, this is a set of, I use these for rebuilding scuba regulators. They're O-ring picks, but I use them a lot. Sometimes, you know, to reach down in and grab a hold of something, you know, a little spring or something like that. I use them when I do these videos too as a pointer, but these are made by Peterbilt, and I like these a lot. They were worth the money. I've had these for 20 years. Used them, like I said, for rebuilding scuba regulators, but they work well on guns. A couple more things, and then we'll wrap up. It looks like we're getting toward the end of the hour.
One other question, Scott.
Sure.
Besides the Croil, do you recommend anything else for carbon solvent?
Oh, for a carbon solvent, geez, just about any of the gun solvents work pretty well if you let them soak. There's nothing that's really going to break through, the really, really heavy, sometimes you just need to scrape. But Croil's good because it'll get down in the threads of nuts and bolts and, muzzle devices and things like that. It's a really good penetrating oil. And then once you get the two parts apart, then you can go at it with, another solvent and a brush. But the PB Blaster and the Croil, that's really what they're meant to do, is penetrate down into the threads. So that would be my recommendation. These blocks are really nice for working on AR-15s. This is for working on a lower. So this would go in a vise, and then that sits right on top of it. And that way you can, if you're going to build an AR-15 lower, you can do it, with this in a vise, and that way you don't have to hold on to the lower. Also, if you're going to clean AR-15s, it's nice to put the gun in and just, open it up, and you can get to everything without, it's kind of like a third hand. So these are very helpful, and they're like $5. It's called a vise block, and they're super handy. Or you can also just take a piece of wood and cut it to that dimension. That works pretty well too, but I like this because it has this tapered ledge that matches the ledge on the magazine. And then if you have the mag release installed in the lower, it actually clips into place so that it won't slide on and off like that. So a mag block is really nice to have. And then along the same lines for an AR-15 upper, this is the same idea. So this is two halves, clamshells, and this one is made to take both the M4 flat top uppers and then these old A1 and A2 style carry handle uppers, and it clamshells together like so, and then fits down in a vise. So when you're installing an AR-15 barrel, you're going to need this piece because this will sit in the vise, and then you're going to be torquing the barrel nut down, and there's just no way to hold on to the upper and then put enough torque on it. You cannot resist that torque. So a set of these is going to be a must-have if you're going to do your own upper. And once again, these aren't expensive. They're $10 or $12, and they're very handy to have, especially for cleaning, a really, really fouled up barrel. You can put this down in a vise and you can clean it from the chamber side and hold it stationary. So those are a couple of AR specific tools, but strongly recommend them. And then as far,
hey Scott, we got 7 minutes.
Okay, I'll be done here in just shortly. One last thing to cover is vices, not smoking and poor dating habits, but actual vices for holding things. I have two. I have a great big, anvil-sized vise that I use a lot, but I just picked this up recently at Harbor Freight, and it clamps on the bench so you can move it around. And it's great if you don't really need to put a lot of torque on stuff. You can just, put this down, and if you just want to hold your gun steady while you work on it, it's like a third hand. This thing is super, super useful, and it swivels this way, and it also swivels this way. So I can't remember how. I think it was $29. It's not the greatest quality thing in the world, but it is really, a vise is a must-have if you're going to do a lot of work on guns. Eventually, you're going to need to hold something stationary while you work on it, and this would be a decent solution for most things. But the big vise, they're really, really nice to have if you have the room. And then if you don't have a lot of room, this works really well. This is a drill press vise. So this is meant to go on the deck of a drill press, but it works really well for a benchtop. You know, I've used these, I've loaned these to people to build AR lowers, because you can just clamp this in place and then set your lower on it and use it to work. So, you know, these aren't expensive either. These are, you know, Harbor Freight has these. They're pretty cheap, but it's basically just a drill press vise, or I think they use them on mills as well. I don't have a mill, so I don't know, but you know, a vise, a work holding device of some kind. And then if you're going to get a vise, these are for my big vise, get a set of soft jaws or make a set of soft jaws. So these go down in like that, and they're meant to protect whatever's being held. They'll grip it tight, but they won't damage anything. The plastic is soft. So you can use aluminum, you know, a couple of just strips of aluminum. Wood works well. I just pick up these magnetic vise blocks myself, because they just stick right to the vise jaws and I don't have to worry about them. So, you know, you're going to want to pick up something to protect the work if you're going to be clamping it in a vise. So anyway, that's kind of just one last thing. If you're over 40, a magnifying visor. This is really, really handy and useful. It has a light on it, and I can wear it over my glasses, and I'm able to see in great detail with one of these. So, you know, if you do need it, I'm not ashamed to wear it. I look like a dork, and my son ridicules me every time I put it on my head, but I found it to be immensely usable and handy to have. So that pretty much covers all of the hand tools that I use regularly on guns. This stuff covers about, and Allen wrenches, but I think everybody's got a set of standard metric Allen wrenches if you don't get them.
Metric or
both standard and metric.
Thank you.
I have both. I have both. Because yeah, there is a difference, and do not try to fit the wrong one in. You'll just strip the head out and be angry. But that's pretty much about 90% of what I do with guns is done with this stuff. I have a drill press. I have other power tools, but you shouldn't need much of that stuff for just, you know, taking guns apart, cleaning them, upgrading them, and working on them. This, you know, this should give you some idea of what you need. And you can pick up a lot of this stuff used. Like I said, yard sales. You don't need to spend a lot of money. You know, used tools are great. I like the character on them, like used guns. All right, well.
So Scott, Karen dropped a little question in the chat. She was wondering whether or not, wouldn't a Geisel reaction rod be better for barrels?
Probably. I don't, the Geisley reaction rod, I don't want to spend $90 on one. I'm cheap. I've always gotten by without it, but I've heard great things about them. I wouldn't argue with you on that point. I can't say from personal experience. From what I understand, yeah, they're great tools, but $90 is a long way toward a really nice Geisley trigger. So I'd rather give my money to Geisley in a trigger and than a guide rod, but no argument against them.
All right, folks, any other questions? Like, drop them in the chat. Let's have something. I think it was a pretty comprehensive, other than, you know, slagging on the old guys for the eyesight.
Yeah.
And I think it was pretty comprehensive overview of the bench. All right, folks, we are at the top of the hour, -2 minutes. So if you've got questions, now's a good time to ask them. Otherwise, I'm going to call the shot.
All right. Well, thanks for.
Hold on. All right, Lonnie, you got to read that.
This one says Geisley should do a 2-for-1 reaction rod and trigger set with a set of
loops.
Looks like loops for us old guys.
Gals.
Sorry,
yeah.
Karen.
Jeweler's loops, like the magnifying glass.
Yeah, I'd buy it. I love Geisley. Anything with Geisley on it's probably going to be top quality. I can't argue. Their triggers. I haven't even, since I got the first Geisley, I've never bought another trigger. I just don't see the need to try anything else. No, they're excellent.
I'm just too lazy to start swapping triggers.
Yeah,
Ah.
well. All right. Well, so we are out of time. It is now exactly at the top of the hour. So I want to thank everybody for coming.
What was the
Scott,
brand of visor, Scott?
This I got on Amazon, and it is Beilishi, Beilleshi.
Oh, put it in the comments. Nobody's
Yeah.
going to remember that.
Yeah.
That works
Type
great.
that in, Scott.
Drop it in the Discord. Put it in the comments. I think we're good.
All right. Well,
Once
next
again,
week.
thanks. Yeah, next week you're going to have a guest host, right?
Yeah. We've got a 1911 guy.
You got a 1911 guy. Kyle's going to come in and tell us all about how to not screw that up and put that divot into the side of the slide every time you try to take the damn thing down.
How to avoid the idiot mark, and how to avoid putting the barrel bushing into your forehead.
There you go. These are things that are going to be important for everybody to know. Thanks all for showing up. I'm going to go ahead and kill the video, and it'll be available on YouTube in, I don't know, about 20 minutes or so.
20 minutes to an hour.